I think we've relegated stories to entertainment versus these are central to our way of making sense of and finding meaning in our own experiences. For me, I think it's partially an attempt to do that, to be like, these are all the things that are at play, literally, in our everyday, and all stories are engaging with that, but maybe as modern people, we've forgotten how central they are to the human experience.
Welcome to the Origins of Creativity podcast, brought to you by Bookling Media, where we discover the magic behind creativity through the stories of passionate creators. Listen in and fill your creative vessel with delightful insights and uplifting tales. Today, our guest shares how creative expression evolves, the impact of media on inspiration, neurodiversity, and the balance between escapism and digging deep with creativity. Please be sure to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app. This way, you won't miss the next episode and it helps others find us. Today's guest is a New York Times bestselling author-illustrator of many books for children and adults, such as Invisible Things and A Pizza with Everything on It. He is also the creator of the popular podcast Creative Pep Talk, which Vanity Fair says is every bit as bright and effervescent as its title would lead you to believe. For the past 15 years, today's guest has worked as a commercial illustrator for a wide array of top-tier clients like Apple, Xbox, and the New York Times. He lives in Columbus, Ohio with his wife, 3 kids, and 2 dogs. Thank you so much for joining me today on the show, Andy J. Pizza.
Thanks for having me here, Becky.
Great. I'm excited to chat about your creative origins and what has inspired you along the way. You've worked as an illustrator in both picture books and in the commercial space. Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, I think that there are pros and cons to both, but if I had to pick, I would pick picture books.
I was figuring that just because of just the youthful energy that you you give off, and I was curious to know how was your creativity when you were a kid?
Yeah, I think I was a pretty creative kid, and I think that came from I'm pretty vocal about being ADHD, and I think
Yes.
ADHD is very misunderstood, and then also it varies based on the person. So person to person, it kind of manifests in different ways. For me, it manifests as this deep allergy to boredom, and the and what's amazing is like one of the most touching moments of my life is seeing this clip of a doctor saying that we actually have brain scans that show the brains of ADHD people when they're bored, it activates the pain centers that they experience it as pain. And the thing about that is the way I've described boredom my entire life, true boredom. And it's not about, and the thing about, and why I bring it up is if I have some freedom, I'm never bored. So as long as I've got a little bit of access to paper and pencil and I can make videos as long as I can keep that extra, it's really like an extra amount of attention, busy doing things, then I'm good. I don't get bored when I'm on my own. I get bored if they're like, sit here for 8 hours, then might struggle if I don't have very much autonomy to get creative. And so I think I was always, as a kid, finding whatever margin, literally, on the page, whatever margins I could fill with creativity, be it on the page or time of day or whatever. So I think from a young age, I was drawing pictures. I also think it was kind of a regulating activity for my emotions, drawing cartoons, coming up with stuff. I was constantly coming up with new characters. I played pretend way past what's considered normal. I didn't act it out, but one of the ways that I would get to sleep if I was struggling in college was to like pretend I was a superhero in my mind. So I've always been creative. It's always been a big part of my journey. And I think a lot of it's just managing boredom.
Did you get in trouble ever with the ADHD? I can just
Yeah.
imagine this is going to be yes.
Yes, I got in trouble, but it's interesting because I think just for a bunch of other different factors, I'm also a bit of a recovering people pleaser. And so I hated getting in trouble. So I tried very hard to mask. I tried really hard to get through everything and do so in a orderly and appropriate fashion. But and for people like that, usually it really catches up to them in high school
Mm.
when there's a lot to manage. So I was actually good at school by a lot of factors up until that point. But once you had to like manage outside of school and your schedule and your workload and you're really getting into some stuff that if you're not interested in it, you're going to struggle. That's when it really got very difficult. But I got in trouble quite a bit for being a class clown and that's that sort of thing too.
Did your creativity, did your drawings ever save you or get you out of trouble in that sense?
I don't know, but I can tell you that they definitely help me engage. So I am one of those people that if I'm doodling, I'm listening better. And so
Right.
if I go to a conference, I'll tell you a way that has kind of benefited me now. If I go to, I went to a podcasting conference where I'm really the only illustrator. So when I was at that conference, I just did what I always do, which I was drawing the whole time. And I thought, oh, I'll just take visual notes and decided I liked how they turned out. So I posted them on Instagram and ended up that podcasting conference, shared all of those, and then brought me back the next year and paid me to do it. So
Oh,
I
that's
think,
really cool.
that is kind of some of the ways that it has started to maybe benefit me.
Absolutely. That is a like direct way
Yeah.
in a like perfect way for that
Yeah.
to be beneficial. And behind the scenes as you're doodling, noodling, that's obviously improving your craft and your
Hmm.
skill, and which has come to where we are today with your picture books, you're working with in the commercial field and in the commercial space.
Yeah.
And do you have any stories about creativity? Was there something that you worked on that you wouldn't have thought of, if X didn't happen, if some tool or material wasn't in front of you?
One that comes to mind is I I was really obsessed with there's this voice recorder in Home Alone 2 called the Talk Boy. And I saw that movie and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that is the coolest thing ever." And I was like, "That's number 1 on my Christmas list. I definitely want that." I don't really know what I thought I would do with it, but what it ended up being was me recording like fake radio shows with my friends,
Yes.
which definitely feels like what is a podcast other than a fake radio show? Like that's what
Yes,
it is. Yeah.
absolutely.
So we did all kinds of stuff like that.
My sister and I did that too. And we were
Did
little. We would
you?
take a cassette tape and we'd do, like the evening news and the weatherman, and we'd have like
Yeah.
sound effect of chopper going above us, and yeah, it was just
Amazing.
stuff like that. And that brings me to think about kids today and how they're using and consuming so much, technology, and they're not making the
As
things.
much
And
stuff, yeah.
yeah, like you said, the boredom wasn't sitting in the chair, and that's the real boredom of like sit here, do nothing, but the freedom, like you said, to go find the things to play with, like, oh, here's mom's sewing stuff. Let me pretend I'm a seamstress, or, all the things that kids can do that they don't. And I think that hopefully will come back. I'm trying to keep
Mhm.
a positive attitude, and maybe kids will get tired of the devices and go create things. But at the same time, having the technology has been good to show them how to do fun crafts that we wouldn't have had as kids.
Yeah. I do think that that's true. I also think I've seen in my parenting and some parents that I know, one way that there's a way to flip that on its head with the technology thing. So I think as we get further into the screen age that we're in, the screen era, we're seeing all of the awareness around the detrimental effects that it can have on kids when it's overdone. And so I wouldn't say that I'm definitely not perfect in this way as a parent, but we try to have screen limits But I think one caveat to that can be if you're not like consuming on a screen, you can have more time. You can create. I will let my kid draw
Yes.
on the iPad. I'll let them make a movie with their friends. I'll let them do a voice call and be on Google Docs writing. And so I think that it can be a real enabler for creativity because they're doing things that I wasn't doing until I was 15, 16, 17, 18, and they're doing
Exactly.
them before they're 10. And so it can do
Yes.
that. I think it's just
Yes.
about channeling it and seeing the opportunity with it.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
There's YouTube videos and then, they can go create from that. And like you
Yep.
said, letting them have that drawing time or if my son's interested in history, he's learning about it and then he's drawing all of the maps. It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
that kind of outlet. But so you're talking about ADHD and, I've heard you speak a little bit about the Invisible Things series that you have that also is the picture book. So I was curious if you could describe what they look like for our listeners a little
Yeah.
bit and what they represent.
Sure. So Invisible Things is kind of a magical realism idea that I co-wrote with my wife, Sophie Miller. And it's really trying to get at, like when I go do a school visit, I will say, what percent of the world, of the universe, do you think is visible to the human eye?
Mm.
And we get all kinds of different guesses. Some of them know, like, okay, if you're asking this, it's going to be surprising. So I'm going to lean into that. Some of them do like an obvious guess. I think if you would have asked me before I knew the truth, I probably would have said probably 80% is visible. And then there's a big spectrum that's like non visible stuff. But it's really more like 5% is visible. So the majority of our existence and experience and universe is invisible. And I wanted to personify those forces. And so we made them into characters. So there are things like the first one I ever came up with was a whisper. My wife came up with the second one, which was an echo, which was kind of a little poetry to a whisper and an echo. But then, we came up with gravity and dark matter, and then things like sadness and melancholy and all kinds of different invisible forces. So they go anywhere from things we can sense with our other senses outside of vision to things that exist inside of us, like feelings, experiences. And then it can also be scientific kind of forces in the universe. And really, so they look like little creatures. I like to think of them as having a nebulous sort of existence where they change a lot, they ebb and flow, they're very like colorful and they kind of like change, but they're just little creatures. And right behind me, if you could see me, I have a big poster and they're all kind of in a grid. So yeah, they're just like little simple creatures that personify different abstract forces. And the purpose of that and how it relates to ADHD for me is it really illustrates a shift that I had in life. So, like I said, I was pretending in fantasy way longer than most people uh, do that. And that's great. I'm glad that I was imaginative and creative, but in some ways, it was an escape from life. It was a way to disassociate from reality. And when I started to learn about these invisible forces, it wasn't until I was probably in my late teens, started reading about like pop quantum physics articles and stuff like that I started to realize like, oh, our universe is actually super cool. Like being in the moment has so much to offer. And I think Invisible Things illustrates this shift I had of I'm going to get what I need, not by escaping now, but going deeper into now, being more present, more here, and more interested and engaged in life and saying kind of yes to real life and engaging it too with my creativity and imagination. But that's really what I think Invisible Things is about.
That's wonderful because people, especially creatives or creative professionals, can use those that kind of tool in their own life to
Yeah.
kind of rein in what's the point of this? What am I working on? What details am I looking at? And for the neurodivergent, which is often many of the creatives we all know and
True.
love,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Sometimes that Venn diagram is just a circle. Yeah.
exactly, we can relate so much
Yeah.
to that. And the abstraction of it also kind of like for the kids who are reading the picture books, they can realize that there are all the things that they can't necessarily put an image to, that
Yeah.
your images do that. And it's a great tool for them as well, and nothing is too abstract or unattainable as kids. And I appreciate that you've got that there for them to access, which it's not too complicated. I mean, I think adults overcomplicate things,
Right. Yeah.
and as big as things can be, and scientifically and in the world, I think that's a great tool. And do you use it for yourself emotionally? Like, do you just, okay, this is me today, this is me in this moment, and I need to kind of regroup and recenter, or anything like
Yeah,
that?
I do. I do think of it almost, I think of it a little bit more like, and this is a little grandiose, but it's still an inspiration for me to think of it closer to like mythology. So I think that
Yes.
I'm really interested in and kind of lit on fire by the like Jungian psychologist that would have this psychoanalytic reading of a myth or a fairy tale. And the central idea there is like when you're reading Sleeping Beauty, you're not thinking of like, this is about how princesses and princes do this and there's a dragon, and it's not really anything about that. It's really, these are all, if you look at it through this lens, they're all pieces of the same psyche. So there's a part of you that's asleep, and there's another part of you that needs to wake up and wake that part of you up, and it needs to get through this part of you that's in the way, the shadowy part of you. And so I think one of the things I like about it and why it maybe helps me is that it helps me to externalize my experience in a way that throughout time, people have done that with stories and myths and fairy tales and whatever. So it's doing what maybe lots of stories do. But I think the reason why I wanted to be more explicit that that's what was happening was because I think we've relegated stories to entertainment versus these are central to our way of making sense of and finding meaning in our own experiences. So for me, I think it's partially an attempt to do that, to be like, these are all the things that are at play literally in our everyday. And all stories are engaging with that. But maybe as modern people, we've forgotten how central they are to the human experience. Does that make sense? Sorry, that's kind of a grandiose answer to that,
I
but yeah.
love it. I mean, that's exactly true, because you're right. And people churn out different entertainment things with,
Yeah.
a message. Sometimes there's a underlying thing, and we can apply it, but a lot of people might not.
Yeah.
And I think that yours is cool because it's labeled. This is this thing, and it's here it is, this correlation of what these things are together.
Mhm.
And so many people, I think, benefit from that association. And outside of creativity, when you are quote unquote consuming or learning or taking in content, is it, are you going off to sci-fi, are you looking at adventure, like what kind of things inspire you when you're just doing your own thing? Obviously it sounds like psychology and that kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, all of that stuff really does it for me. Just real quick, I wanna reverse to something that you said.
Yeah.
A lot of times, I actually think not all, but most or a lot of stories are about a character changing. It's about
Mm.
a character going on an arc, which is a type of learning. And I think that even if it doesn't have a message, it has something that helps us think about how it gives us a new concept, even to a way of thinking about life. And there's this really interesting study that I came across once where they read a Clifford book, the Big Red Dog. They read a book to a group of kids, and it was about a three-legged dog that keeps getting excluded from the pack. When they read it and then they asked the kids, like, what is this about? Their initial response was, I think, what our response is to most media, which is just this surface level engagement. We got what happened in the story. What they'd be like, well, it means that you should include the three-legged dog. That's what it's about. And then, but the cool thing that happened, this is something that's really interesting to me, is that once they explained it, once they were like, no, this is about anybody that's different should be included. You shouldn't exclude people because they're different. Once they did that, they understood the story, they correlated it with the story, and then it became like portable, like it became part of their view. And so for me, I think for really good reason, we have gotten away from being heavy-handed with messages. I think in our storytelling, I do think that's good as creative people, because the most powerful encounters are the ones that we lose ourselves in. So you do want that. But I think culturally, we've lost our sense of the power that story has in our lives. And part of that, I think, is because we don't engage it seriously. We don't engage it. We watch the movie, we turn it off, and that's it. We don't even have the tools. This is one of the reasons why, like on my podcast, Creative Pep Talk, I like to talk a lot about storytelling, is because there's also just research to back this up, but I deeply have experienced that learning about storytelling, getting the vernacular to engage with it, getting the literacy kind of to understand what's going on a few different levels, has meant that stories have had a huge impact on my life and the way I see my life and the way I move through my life. There's these great studies on what it does to see your life as a quest, to see your external world relating to your internal journey. It's just an amazing thing. And so I think the way that, yes, it's good that in literature and in the artistry, we've gotten less heavy-handed. We've gotten less
The didactic,
moralistic,
preachy.
and preachy. I think we've evolved in that in a way that's really powerful and good. But I think on an entertainment level, culturally, we have lost. Because of that, it's become relegated to nothing more than a way to pass time. And so, anyway, I like this thing of this Clifford story, because I feel like I really hope that we can have book clubs and movie clubs and engage with them like we always have as humans. Because I think we've lost our sense of meaning partially because of that.
There's so much to consume, so much flashing lights in our face on jumping from one to the other, that is something that people can't, if it's just flashing in their face, they can't just stop and pause and digest it.
Yeah.
And like you said, a book club, something where, you're talking about it with the community. You're kind of like when I would look at poetry in 8th grade, at first I would just read it, and then they would, they'd break it up into pieces, and you'd kind of analyze each line. And it was like, who does that, unless you're studying that, like now, who takes the time to dissect something creative that you've taken in? And exactly true. And with storytelling, as I've been interviewing people, just seeing how they are telling their stories of their life, their experiences in their art, as well as whatever they're, if they're dissecting that poem, they then are reading more into that other person who made that poem. And I completely think you've hit the nail on the head with what it needs to be and what it can be. And that's just wonderful.
And I think also the other thing that occurs to me is that it might, if we had a more vigorous or robust set of tools for engaging in a story. This is maybe too optimistic, but it's it's something that sounds good to me right now.
Sure.
Is that, but I think there's some truth here that if we had a little bit more of means of engaging, I wonder if we could have more tolerance for reading, and then tolerance for a movie even versus TV versus TikTok. And I think the thing I think about that's really interesting about that to me is what I like about movies. I like movies. I like TV. I like short form video on occasion. Occasion meaning every day. Trying to do less. Trying to do less. But I think there's some value in it for sure. But I've thought a lot about how movies. What I like about movies is they have the potential for telling a full story, a 3-act story that has a beginning, middle, and end, has a conclusion, has an arc, has character change, can pay off. I think it's very difficult to pull that off well, but it has the potential there. What then when we move to a TV culture, which we've had this golden age of television, and in a lot of ways it's been phenomenal. The only thing I get a little bit like, I don't like this, is that the fact that very few TV shows finish well means that I think most TV episodes are like a act 1 and act 2. And it's just playing on our more base nature of like, I got to know what happens next. I got to know what happens next. Until you get to the end, you're like, well, that was a complete waste of time because they had no idea where it was going. It had no point and it didn't pay off. And then
That's
even
how many series are too, series that'll,
most.
they just kind of, it's over now. And you're just like, well, what was the ending? But I watched a whole bunch of stuff.
And it's not really all the creator's fault because they're dealing with all these things of, we don't know how many episodes we're going to get to make, all these different, there's so much to that equation. But I do think about like, oh, what's one thing I feel like, oh, we're losing a conclusion and a point of view and all that. And then you go to short form video and you think, I don't even know what sliver of a story this is, but it is just the like most base nature. It's giving us not very much in the way of making meaning, with media. So anyway, it's a little.
You're right. Like it's like we can dig deeper, and I think a lot of creatives are digging deep, and that's what makes their art
I love that.
Cool. It's like coming out because they are digging deep, and they're able to show that or represent it in some other way. And yeah, you're right. I think things have really changed, and I miss the sitcoms from like the 80s and 90s that I thought they were really well done, and some of them, the writing is just so deep, and it crosses over the entire episode, and it seemed like it had more passion to it and purpose. And I think now I'm not a huge sitcom watcher now, if there are that many, but it feels like something's lost, and I'm sure it has to do with just there's so much demand, so much trying to get attention back to like one thing that isn't possible. It just isn't possible in all the noise.
And don't get me wrong, there's some really great things being made today, of course. But
yeah, and the technology to make them really great and really cool. Yeah, it's that balance, and I think there's a lot of noise, but it's so fun to find a treasure of something in all that, in all of the weeds, to say this is really cool. And I forget the question that I had asked.
Oh, you said you were asking me about. I think it was about like what things inspire me.
Yes, what kind of thing? Yeah. What were the things? Yeah, TV or subject matter that inspires you, and you just kind of go down the rabbit hole when you're not working, and then what does that trickle back into your space, in your art space?
I think I read a lot of nonfiction. So I read a lot of stuff in the psychology world and that sort of thing. That stuff definitely filters into all the stuff that I do. I have 3 kids, so we spent a lot of time consuming kids media. Especially like kids movies. That's a big part of our like family dynamic is digging into that. Huge fan of Bluey. My youngest is 10. We're still loving Bluey. All of my kids still love Bluey. And then me and my wife have a pretty good habit of watching movies. And I really like engaging in movies. I love a movie that really pays off in a satisfying way. And then I love to kind of unpick what are the symbols, what's the arc here. And it can be anything from a sci-fi thing like Interstellar to something like Sister Act. I've spent so much time thinking about Sister Act because it's so good. It's so satisfying.
It is.
I love this idea that witness protection is like a symbol of the ego death, like losing your sense of self. Having to get away, she has to step out of the spotlight, right? So I love stuff like that. So I think my wife and I, we write together. So I think we have a decent practice of we watch something and then we really try to dig into it and think about it. We just watched Get Out for the first time because I was too scared to watch it for so long. And everyone's like, you have to watch it. It's not that scary. And that was just like, it's so rich. It was just so fun to like unpick that with my wife.
It reminds me of like cooking. People can eat quickly, go through a fast food restaurant, and then they can actually make something from scratch and enjoy the pieces that go into it. And then, as you eat it, you can appreciate all of those things. And for others to watch someone cook and then eat their meal, to say, wow, I really saw what went into that, what they were thinking of, what they wanted to make it work together. And I just thought of that as you were saying that, how you can really dig into it.
And it kind of, speaking of really dig into it, I think it illustrates that same idea that it's been the lifelong difficult lesson for me to learn, which is escapism versus going deeper. I call myself Annie J Pizza because I love pizza. What that used to look like when I was younger was eating as much pizza as humanly possible. And that really is almost like an escape. It's like, oh, I just want to eat all this so I feel good and I'm, enjoying myself. Versus now, my relationship to pizza is much more mature. And I'm looking for like, where's the chewy Neapolitan dough and where I got to get the goat cheese and really like, what's the story of the pizza? I want to
yes, really the story of the
pizza. And so like, I think for me that, there's a shift there too of like, you can engage in media in a way where it's like, how can I use this to escape? Or you can use it as a tool for going deeper in life. And I just want to say, I think both are valid.
Right.
I think they're valid. I just think there's a balance that is a positive thing in my life.
And as adults, we can, hopefully choose to be mindful and, decide, okay, how much time am I going to spend on the, quote unquote candy of, shorts and okay, I did too much, which is hard, or the pizza. And then, there's, time for all of that. And then there's also, like you said, time for being present, and being present is paying attention to those things. And with ADHD, people think, oh, they're not paying attention, but that's not true. They're paying attention to what is interesting. And that could be the class teacher speaking about, math, or it could be, the fly walking across the window and how it, where is it going? What's its story? So it's definitely, it's a different perspective. And I think, like I said before, like so many creatives probably are ADHD or have neurodivergency with their world, and that's how it becomes creative. It's different, it's new, it's a different perspective. And so, do you find it necessary, speaking of ADHD, to have many different creative outlets, or are you just like hyper focused on one type of thing over and over again?
I have a ton of creative outlets. I really like that. Usually I think it was a life skill for me to learn how to manage that energy or that desire to have a lot of different things going on and a lot of different goals and all that. And I've figured out a lot of frameworks for organizing. I'm like the thing I was talking about earlier with psychoanalytic reading of things. I'm big in, because of my brain is so chaotic, I'm huge on externalizing your mind. So I love frameworks. I love ways of organizing thoughts. And so for me, one thing that was really helpful was to start thinking, I talk about this on the podcast a lot. I organize projects into front burner, back burner, and then crock pot. Okay. So you got crock pot's everything that's soaking. And I almost never throw anything away. I'm like, because there's just too much grief in that. So I'm like, okay, you know what? You're going in the crock pot. Okay. I'm not going to do you right now, but maybe we will later. I had to put picture books in the crock pot for 4 years as the podcast was taking off. Right. And so to me, it's really a project oriented way of thinking. It's a way of thinking like, okay, I'm focusing on this now. And usually my back burner is kind of like, this is how I'm making a living. This is like just stuff that I'm continuing to stir. I like it. I'm doing it. But it doesn't require my heightened creative focus to like push into a new world. The front burner is that. Front burner is like, okay, what is the thing that I'm trying to break into? I'm really giving all of my extra heightened focus on, and then the crockpot stuff that I get to later. So I think it would be a misconception and not a very good lesson for people to look at what I do and think, oh, he's a public speaker. He does illustration, he does client work, he does picture books, he has a podcast, blah, 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 all these different things. And be like, I want to do that. And I'll just run in 10 different directions at the same time. But that's not the way that it developed. And I think it's impossible. There's a book called The One Thing. It's a really great book. It's so good. And it really helped me as an ADHD person see, like, if you take one step in 10 different directions, you might get somewhere interesting in like 10 years. You might in one of those places. But that is too long to sustain that motivation, to wait for that payoff. You are not going to sustain that. So for me, it's been great to do project-based approach of, okay, for the spring, I'm going that way. And at the end of the spring, I will be in an interesting place with that. I will have written the manuscript, or I will have finished the picture book. I will have submitted it, and so it's, yeah. So I do like doing all these things, but
Yeah, is that how the creative pep talk started then? Were you just
yeah,
trying
that
it
was
and
the
then
season.
and it worked and it was building and so you focused on that. That
I
was
knew when I started that, I'd already done a talk really when I was starting the podcast, because the majority of them are solo episodes. We do some interviews. I started it as like a portfolio of talks. That's what I was thinking, because I wanted to get invited to conferences, and I had a really good experience doing a talk, and I was like, I want to do more of that. Sometimes if I'm not sure and I start a project, I'll try to make it small so that I can commit. I'm like, all right, I'm going to do this for a week, or I'm going to do this for 5 pictures or whatever. But the podcast, I had enough evidence to be like, I think this is like a thing for me. And so I had the rough goal of, I'm going to do 100 episodes, which is about 2 years of making this show weekly. And that's what I did. I did it. And by the time we hit about 100, it had become a pretty substantial part of my career. And so then that became a back burner thing. I was like, okay, this is just something I do. Can I know how to do it? And then after 4 or 5 years, that's where I could start focusing on picture books again and make that a reality.
Which is great, because then, it's this creative, organic, enjoyable thing that grew. Like tending a flower, or a tree, it grew and it became something fruitful because of your passion that you put into it. And like you said, other people like, can I do XYZ? Can I do all these things? Yes, you can, but what is going to drive it? What's going to make it worthwhile to you personally? And
Yeah.
I wondered how that was for you and how it impacted your creativity in other ways, by, talking through your own pep talk to yourself sometimes,
Oh, yeah.
how,
Yeah.
did that go,
Lots of
okay,
times.
today I'm going to just, because I talked myself up, I'm going to get through this thing that is challenging, or, I don't want to quit on. So yeah. Are there any moments like that? Yeah.
There are tons of moments like that. And I actually think the way that I've come to think of my career at this stage is very much like someone who, like a scientist that's, again, to get grandiose, can't help myself, a scientist that's like both in the lab and in the field.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
in the lab, I'm doing the podcast, I'm picking apart what I did, seeing why it worked, trying to explain it. I'm a big believer in this idea that, I hate the idea that those who teach can't, or those who can't do teach. Actually, it's actually a misconception of that quote originally. And the truth is, like, we know from the research, the opposite is true. Not just that, those that do can teach, but that teaching helps you do. That one of the best ways to study is to learn it and then explain it to somebody else. And so one of the things I love about the podcast is how there's this interplay between, I try to make this picture book with these intentions, this marketing plan, this, all these different things, take everything I learn and then bring it back to the show. And then as I talk about on the show, or I teach it in a workshop or do a talk on it, it becomes clearer to me. I'm like, oh, that's really what I did. And that's really what worked. Now I'm going to go make a picture book, or I'm going to go make some client work. And so to me, there's a real interplay between those two things that is super valuable. And I think from the start, it was important to me, even as the podcast was taking off, I could see that there were opportunities to be like, I'm going to double down on this, and just, who cares about my client work? Who cares about picture books? Whatever. I'm just going to do this because it's working so well. And I'm grateful that I had a little bit of foresight to be like, okay, I actually want to keep, that's as important as anything else. If I don't have that, the podcast is nothing. They have to have a relationship to each other. And so, yeah. And I like also that there's maybe two other pieces to this complicated equation that I have of a career, which often is overwhelming. I'll be honest. It's not all great, but the two things that I think I really like are, one is it gives time. It kind of works in time for what the creative researchers call incubation of an idea, where you can make something halfway, let it sit in your subconscious, let your subconscious work on it. Now I'm working over here. So I'm working on the picture book for a little while. Now I'm working on some episodes, and there's time for it to stew, right?
Yes.
Back to the kind of almost crock pot thing. But there's time for it to go, and develop its own thing. And then when I come back there, I have fresh energy for that. So I never get too stuck in any different direction. The other piece that I like about it, I'm just going on a huge rant here, so sorry.
I love it.
But the other piece that I like is, or the other piece that really helps me with it, other than the organizational aspect, is realizing that for me, there is a through line to all of these things. Probably the way I would describe it is storytelling, but even more than that, I like the Strengths Finder test. It's one of those personality tests that's actually based on a lot of research, and was very helpful for me. I took it probably like 10, 12 years ago. And my top strength was strategy, which is something I never would have thought at that time. And probably because it was just a business word. But then once I understood strategy is a different type of creativity. So there's exploratory creativity, which is you start and you don't know where it's going to go. I've heard John Mayer call that Ouija board creativity. We're like, where's the paintbrush? It's got a paintbrush that's got a mind of its own. That's what I think we think of as creativity. That's one side of it. So I think a really important side is the improvisational side. Then there's the other side, which is the strategic creativity, which is I'm going to start with an end in mind, and I'm going to work backwards. I'm going to creatively build the road back to the start so I know where to begin, which is like a plotting type of energy. And an energy, like we said, you don't see as much in TV these days because it's not starting with the end in mind. But that, so much of what I do is in that energy. I like to improv and I get silly and do all that stuff too. But the podcast and picture books and my illustration, so much of it starts with, okay, I know I want to illustrate this idea. Now I have to work backwards on how to get there.
And I think, just creative thinking is that strategy for getting there. I mean, if one's creative, with materials and things, their brain works to be creative with how they're going to get that thing made, what materials, or how will they build that world, in movies, how will they build that, animatronic thing back in the 80s or 90s, how, and then how will you put it into computers and make that? So it definitely, it plays with both sides. And I think a lot of creative people like you who are very deep thinkers, and people who are writing, let's say Shakespeare, deep thinkers who then make a scene, a world, a story with that.
You just compared me to Shakespeare.
I did,
that's too grandiose. I can't take that. Okay. That's where I draw the line, but I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's definitely the way of thinking. And I can imagine, are you pretty empathetic to kind of pick up on people's emotions?
It can be a crippling thing for me.
Yes, exactly. And it's just that kind of mindset that can make such amazing things and think so deeply and feel so much. So before we get close to the end here, what is next for you? Are you planning more books, or you're continuing the podcast, or any fun ideas that you'd like to try?
We have announced the deal of this, but we really haven't fully announced it. We have a book, a follow-up to Invisible Things called Mysterious Things coming out in the
Nice.
summer. So
Nice.
that's a little behind the scenes where we have announced the deal, so it's out there, but we haven't really started like selling it. I don't think it goes on pre-order until the new year.
Okay.
That is very exciting. Very, very excited about that book. Sophie and I wrote it, and it really highlights the weird side of Invisible Things, which
Ooh, fun.
is a big part of my favorite. And also, I think imagining myself as a kid, I love just weird books. And so we try to
Yes.
capture some of that. So I'm excited about that. We're working on some other maybe longer form projects of that nature. And yeah, still excited about doing the podcast, Creative Pep Talk every week. Always
Good.
have fresh passion for that stuff.
Great. Oh, that's good. That's exciting. I can see that being a nice, amazing companion to Invisible Things, to have that,
Thanks.
mysterious things, and kids will, and adults of course will enjoy that, because it's, our child like minds can kind of go into that world as well. So looking back on your career now, what advice would you give your young self there in class, being the class clown and doodling all over your stuff? What would
Mm-hmm.
what would you say to yourself?
I think that it's funny because I think it goes along with the point of Mysterious Things. So, Mysterious Things, we don't spell this out because it's a little bit heady. But it's inspired by the center of the book is what's called the knowledge paradox. And the knowledge paradox is this idea that, like, when I was a kid and I was in school and you're learning all of this stuff, I remember feeling like, what a crappy time to be born, where it's all done. It's like we have figured it all
Yes,
out. And they're
right.
like giving me all the answers. Like, yeah, look, before you start getting creative and getting curious, we already did that for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. Here it is. And now just go get a job. That's what I felt like
Yes,
life was like.
absolutely.
You
Like,
know what I
that's not
mean?
fair. Why can't I
It's
be
not
Leonardo da
fair.
Vinci? Why can't I be
Why can't I
creating
do?
these
Yeah, why
things?
can't I
Yeah.
discover something? And actually, we've seen that same thing in our kids. Like our 10-year-old said something like that before we wrote this book, of like just feeling like there's nothing left to do. Like it's all been done.
Yeah.
And you can feel like that as a creative person. And so it took me until way later, when I was finished with school, really finished with high school, that I started to, like I said, get into this pop quantum physics stuff and just these big mysteries and this weirdness of the universe. And I started to discover what they define as this knowledge paradox, which is this idea of the more that we have figured out, the more we realize we don't know.
That's
And
true.
so this idea of, if you go back, I don't know, 100 years or so, there's physicists that are saying things like, we've only got like a little bit left to figure out. We've got like we have almost cracked this baby. And then just shortly after that, 40 years later or something, they start discovering how bizarre everything is. They start finding spooky action, quantum entanglement, all that stuff. And now you get scientists, there's a lot of disagreement about like what percent do we have left. Some people probably still think we've cracked a lot of it, but there are legitimate scientists that are like, we might not have scratched 1%. This universe is wild. And
Yeah.
so that's what I think I would try to instill. And that's why we made the book, of like, I want to instill that in kids' lives before they're done learning, before they think they're done learning. Like there's so much to participate in, and this universe is so cool. And
Yeah.
and so that's, I think I loved my childhood fantasies and imagination. I love all that. All that's great. I wish that I had a little more injected into that, the raw material of how cool our reality is, because then the interplay between imagination and reality, that's where it's like really, really cool and fun. And you get engaged in life. And I wish I had been a little bit earlier, more engaged in reality.
And that makes me think of, today's kids that, instead of feeling that limitation that they can try something else, and even if it's close to something that has been done, it's
Right.
theirs,
Yeah.
it's different, and that the learning doesn't end.
Yeah.
We always feel like, okay, I'm done with school, I'm done learning, or I've graduated college, high school, whatever, I'm done now. And it's like that's kind of when you can start to really digest, like we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg on all the things we're thrown in school. And to dig deeper into those things is what can fuel our creativity and what keeps us going and interested and inspired. So
Definitely.
that's really good advice. I love it. And
Thanks.
yeah, so where, as we finish here, where can people find you online?
Probably the best place to look other than the podcast is Substack. If you go to andyjpizza.substack.com, that's where I send out a newsletter with about once a week with the podcast episode, maybe some thoughts, and also updates on books and stuff. And you can just go see all of those posts on Substack and get a sense of like what I'm all about.
Great. Perfect. I will put that in the show notes and other ways to find you as well, and your books and podcast. And is there anything else that you're just dying to share about your creative journey, and any final thoughts?
I'll say one last thing, which is to me, the bedrock of being creative starts with a positive self-psychology. It's a thing that says, I mess up. I've done things that I don't like, but at the bottom of all that is a good thing that I want to cultivate and I want to get out of myself and I want to put it on a page and a canvas and put it out in the world. If you don't have that as your base, you're going to have a hard time cultivating it. I say it like this, like art is self-expression. You're not going to like expressing yourself. You're not going to like the self-expression that you make if you hate the thing it's an expression of, which is you. So this relationship to yourself, I think, is really, really key. So I'll leave it there. Like I would encourage people to cultivate a positive view of yourself.
I think you're right. You're so right, and that is wonderful to leave the episode on, because people can take that and hopefully dig deep in themselves and in their life, right?
Yes.
And get into it and try to figure out what they are, and who, if they like themselves, and how they're projecting that in their art. Thank you so much, Andy.
Thanks, Becky.
This has been fun and quite inspiring, I must say. And I really enjoyed talking about, the neurodiversity and how creativity can impact it, and, our emotions. And it was quite a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to also thank our listeners, of course. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, you could share this podcast with others who might find it valuable as well. We want to reach people who would like a bit of inspiration on their own creative journey. So until next time, I'm Becky Gehrisch. Happy creating.
Hey there, creative minds. Are you ready for the next burst of inspiration? Make sure to subscribe to the Origins of Creativity podcast in your favorite podcast app for all our latest episodes. Visit booklingmedia.com/podcast for show details, links to connect with us, and so much more. This has been the Origins of Creativity podcast, where inspiration meets imagination.